Power creep. This term should be familiar to anyone who's ever played a long-running RPG game. I've been asked about it a few times on this channel, but repeatedly put it off because it's a game design topic which is rather niche and unusual to explain, since it only affects a very specific type of game. For the majority of games, this is not something which their developers need to think about, let alone have experience in handling. Fortunately and/or unfortunately, I do have some experience working with that type of game, both for development and for live operations. So let's discuss how and why power creep happens. And before you comment, yes, there's a lot more reasons beyond just money. It's a reason, just not the only one. Before we begin, we need to explain power level.
Vegeta, what does the scouter say about his power level? It's over 9,000! What, really? Yeah.
In games consisting of multiple characters, rarities, skills, abilities, and other variables, there is a vague concept of a power level and a cost. This loosely refers to how well that character or skill performs at their intended role in relation to the cost of obtaining or deploying them. So an attacker gets evaluated based on their DPS, a tank gets evaluated based on how much damage they can soak, and so on. This performance is then weighted against the cost of obtaining them. So if an attacker has a higher rarity, is found later in the game, costs more resources to deploy, or is generally harder to obtain, it only gets compared against other attackers with a similar cost, because their circumstances are different. To use a few game examples, in the mobile RPG game Honkai Star Rail, there are the characters Sampo and Black Swan. Both share a similar playstyle of applying a stackable damage over time status to enemies to deal damage, and are even the same element. Between the two, Black Swan has higher damage and stronger debuffs. However, since Sampo is a 4-star character who is easy to get, while Black Swan is a 5-star character who requires significant resources or money to obtain, it's not exactly fair to compare them. In Pokemon, the Geodude and Rhyhorn lines are rock-ground type tanks with similar stat distributions, but Rhydon and Rhyperior far outperform Golem. However, Geodude are common early game encounters and evolve early, whereas Rhyhorn are late game encounters, evolve at a high level, and also require an item. In earlier generations, Rhydon also learns no moves outside of TMs. So even though Rhyperior has a better performance than Golem, their different costs means neither is strictly superior to the other. Power level and costs are common considerations taken into account by game developers. On the most basic level, better abilities and characters require greater investment costs to obtain. This cost could be interpreted as effort, such as being a reward for completing a quest, or exploring a new area, or be a literal cost like requiring you to spend in-game resources or real-life money to obtain. There's a lot of ways to design around this. Play it straight, subvert it, you get the idea, we move on. Well, that's the introduction to power levels done. Now for power creep. What players usually call power creep actually refers to two different yet related phenomena. There are no formal names for them, so forgive my own uncreative names. Designers are generally awful with naming stuff. We leave that to the localization team. Direct power creep happens when a new option functions identically to an older one, but has a much better performance to cost ratio. Either they yield a better performance for the same cost, offer a similar performance for less cost, or some combination of both. Bear in mind that when I say direct, I do mean he does everything I do, but better. If a character is only considered better due to the differences making them synergize better with certain teams, that isn't direct power creep, but rather what I call meta power creep. This happens when a player community's interactions forms a meta game. Through playing, discussing, theory crafting, and testing, a consensus gradually forms regarding which specific qualities are considered more valuable than others, what roles certain characters should fulfill, and which contexts are considered important. This type of power creep happens when new additions and changes to the game cause older options to get replaced within the meta. Here's a couple of examples. In Genshin Impact, Barbara and Kokomi are two Hydro healers who perform similar roles. They both heal the party while attacking, can passively heal the active teammate, and apply Hydro to enemies while off-screen. However, there are differences. Barbara heals the party if she attacks while her skill is active. Her skill is applied onto and follows the player character, and it applies Hydro to enemies close to them. Finally, her ultimate is a large instant burst heal, and she can emergency revive a fallen character once every few minutes. Kokomi heals the party if she attacks after activating her ultimate. Her skill deploys a jellyfish onto a fixed position which does not move, and only applies Hydro and heals characters within its range. Her ultimate does not directly provide healing and instead activates a super mode which enhances her regular attacks and allows them to heal. She also has no revive. Comparing the two, Barbara has better overall ease of use and healing consistency, whereas Kokomi has greater heal magnitude, Hydro application and damage, but is conditionally dependent on positioning and lacks an instant heal option. Both also have drastically different costs. Barbara is a common 4-star and Kokomi is an expensive 5-star. Despite their shared roles, both characters have distinct mechanical differences and costs which make them not directly power creep each other. Seems reasonable. However, the player community has concluded that Kokomi power creeps Barbara because her superior Hydro application rate made her more useful for the meta of time-based endgame challenges. Other contexts such as exploration are disregarded because they are not considered important. The rarity difference is acknowledged but disregarded because the metagame is mainly concerned with evaluating the top end of endgame performance. If they don't do this, then we may as well ban every 5-star, and that would be stupid because nobody plays like this. In Pokemon, Incineroar is hailed as the current day king of the VGC metagame, who is agreed to have power crept almost every other Intimidate support such as Arcanine due to its mix of power, bulk, and versatility. However, Incineroar is not an example of direct power creep because it is not directly superior to any other Pokemon. All other Fire Dark Pokemon in the game are glass cannons. Performance-wise, both have equal defenses, but Arcanine has better speed and can use special attacks. Their key differences are their move pools and Incineroar's dark typing. Cost-wise is where they differ significantly. Arcanine is a common Pokemon and naturally learns Intimidate, making it easy to get and use in any game. Incineroar is very rare due to being a starter and gets Intimidate as its hidden ability, which makes it quite difficult to get without trading. In practice, you are never getting an Intimidate Incineroar in any standard game playthrough. However, the player metagame evaluates Pokemon in a simulated single or double battle format where any legal move and ability is usable. This is why competitive players artificially generate their Pokemon. It's an unreasonable waste of time to get them legit otherwise. In these contexts, Incineroar's difficulty to naturally obtain is considered irrelevant, removing Arcanine's cost advantage. When comparing only their ceilings without costs, players judged Incineroar's unique qualities to be more valuable than Arcanine, leading to replacement within the metagame. It is extremely important to understand and distinguish between these two variants of power creep because each comes into existence due to different reasons and gets handled in different ways. Depending on the nature of the game, meta power creep is not only a possibility but a gradual inevitability. It's like climate change. Human activity sped it up, but it was always a slow, natural process. This is due to two key reasons: opportunity cost and limited design space. Let's say we have a hypothetical scenario where all new additions are totally unique and there is zero performance overlap. Maximum team size is still fixed. If you have 50 options but can only use 4, then those options are ultimately in competition with each other. Players will inevitably come together to figure out which combination of 4 produces the best result, however that is defined. Now, realize we don't live in such a scenario. Not all options are made equal. Many are designed for purposes which are totally unrelated to the player's metagames. A character could intentionally be made to help early game players and fall off later as they find better options, or be incredibly overpowered but only obtainable as a post-final boss reward. As the game's life continues, more characters and options get added, each of which have different design objectives made for certain contextual reasons at the time. When this happens, meta power creep is a natural inevitability because the metagame will disregard and eventually forget these contexts until power is all that remains. Direct power creep, on the other hand, is less likely to come about naturally. Its occurrence is dependent on the game's available design space. Depending on how versatile the game's core mechanics are and how many possible combinations of variables are present, a game can afford to make many new additions before eventually being forced to repeat the same idea. Pokemon has its ridiculously extensive type system. Even after 9 generations, we are still missing several type combinations, and stats, abilities, and move pools help make many of them distinct. Genshin Impact has 6 elements, multiple elemental reactions, 5 weapon types, multiple stats such as elemental mastery and energy recharge, different team roles such as shielder, healer, off-field, and many other variables to work with, giving them a huge design space to create different niches in. To put into perspective, it took them over 5 years to add a hydro element shielder. Of course, it does help that Genshin is a real-time combat game. Games with real-time combat are naturally more resilient to direct power creep because they add a big new variable, player preference. Different characters can have different attack patterns and playstyles which make them feel different to play. This variable is huge because it is a subjective one. What is comfortable for one player might be unfun for another, and this will heavily impact their performance and blur the numbers. Novelet and Mualani share an identical element, weapon type, and scale on HP, but both play radically differently, meaning neither directly power creeps the other, regardless of numbers. Unsurprisingly, not everyone enjoys playing French Dragon Power Wash Simulator. This is why I mentioned power creep only affects a few types of games. It is mainly RPG style games that are heavily ruled by numbers and have long lifespans that are susceptible to natural power creep. Genres like platformers, puzzles, fighters, and shooters are much more resistant to power creep due to mechanical differences and player preferences. Single game RPGs also lack power creep because new options don't get added and progression is fixed, meaning you naturally gain more powerful options as you progress. Unfortunately, however, the games which do get affected by power creep are basically every mobile gacha game in the market, which ends up representing a disproportionate amount of players due to how huge mobile gaming is. However, just because power creep is a natural phenomenon doesn't mean developers don't artificially create it. Just like climate change, certain actions can accelerate power creep, turning it from a slow and gradual process into a persistent problem for the player base. This is the situation which gacha games always end up trapped in. Accelerated power creep happens when the developers want to purposely force a metagame shift. This is in turn motivated by several possible reasons. The first is to force people out of their comfort zone. Even though players claim to enjoy seeing new options, the reality is that they aren't all that inclined to actually use them. People are creatures of habit. After investing all the time and resources into building and learning a team of characters whose playstyles they like, they aren't too inclined to repeat the whole process for a new option. If the new option yields an equal performance to the old one and costs the same, they'll just stick with what they know. It's sorta similar to you finding your favorite kind and brand of fruit juice. Even when a new flavor or brand shows up, you aren't too inclined to try something new. This is the foundation behind all consumer spending habits. It's not exactly the same when it comes to game options, but many of the same principles still apply. People don't like change without a reason. The only way to push players into reinvesting into a new character is to promise them a better performance than what they already have. The second is to fabricate a sense of progression. In standard RPGs, progression is straightforward, with a clearly defined start and end point. You start at level 1 and you end at whatever level you kill God at. Live service games like Star Rail lack this. You start at level 1, progress to the level cap of 80, and then you are stuck there. But the game continues progressing for years after, with new enemies, weapons, mechanics, and worlds. The developers need to escalate the game by adding more difficult content, but are unable to scale the existing characters any further. So they have to add newer characters which are more powerful than older ones to respond to the more difficult enemies. This results in an arms race between the players and enemies, but compared to the alternative of mechanical stagnation, it's arguably the lesser of two evils. The speed of the escalation may be debatable, but the fact that it has to happen is not. The third is to meet expectations. If your game builds up hype and excitement for a character or legendary weapon, then you need to successfully pay off that hype. Fail to live up to that hype and you get cases like that one Goku and Vegeta unit in Dokkan.
We Saiyans have no limits.
Let's charge again. Full power!
This is usually not an issue for normal games because the payoff typically comes at the story's narrative climax, usually as the protagonist gains the power to kill God or something. The only thing after that is an epilogue or post-game. But live service games contain multiple stories, each with their own separate narrative build-ups and climaxes. This causes the hype cycle to repeat continuously, and since these stories are all part of a single overarching story, each subsequent cycle must be grander than the last. Stories aren't the only way to do this, but they usually serve to create the context for the hype. Long-running game series aren't immune to this either. Sequels constantly aim to improve upon their predecessors in various ways, narratives being one of them, causing each new entry to up the stakes of their respective conflicts. This is why legendary Pokemon are constantly getting more and more powerful with each passing generation. The fourth reason is to create value. All of the above reasons have a financial component, but for the sake of convenience, they can all be summarized into this one point. Live service games all rely on additional monetization in various ways. Some could include gacha systems, some could sell DLC, some could have season passes, and so on. In all of these cases, whenever a transaction takes place between the player and publisher, an unspoken agreement gets made. Player spends money and expects to feel happy. If I am not happy, then I won't spend money in the future. Capitalism. The developers need to create value to make that purchase worthwhile. So if they purchase something related to gameplay, the gameplay has to be good. This, unfortunately, does affect alternative genres. I mentioned stuff like fighters, shooters, and puzzle games earlier, but specified they are merely resistant to power creep, not immune. Season Pass characters for fighting games are almost always pretty good for this exact reason. Playstyle and mechanical differences prevent direct power creep, but fundamentally, the characters usually perform very well in a professional context. RPG games and card games which sell DLC and expansions are hit by this particularly bad due to being heavily tied to numbers and stats. They have very few ways to create gameplay value without escalating to bigger numbers. So if you ever wondered why Calyrex and its dumb horse gets 2 abilities, blame them for being sold as the face of a DLC. Of course, gacha games suffer from this most because they regularly include RPG mechanics and involve monetization everywhere, placing them in an endless cycle of needing to create value to keep players happy and spending. We could keep listing reasons, but we'd be here forever. Many different departments all have various agendas and reasons to push the game, and increasing power level is ultimately one of many ways to accomplish that. Of course, there's more to power levels than just increasing it. Just like with climate change and societal development, the game's production goals must be met while limiting power creep to a reasonable pace. If power creep occurs too quickly, players may be discouraged from spending because any purchase they make has such a short shelf life, and new players may feel intimidated from joining the game. Yes, whales will continue to spend and play, but that's a small, focused audience who will spend regardless. The resulting mess of increasing numbers and mechanics affects the game's ability to attract a wider audience, and if too many casual players burn out and quit, it won't be long until the whales lose interest too. Few games can survive exclusively on whales and nothing else. Larger user bases mean revenue and player engagement is much more consistent and sustainable, leading to lower financial risks. There is a good reason why mobile games always aim for a large player base if possible. This is why power creep management is important. Relying solely on bigger numbers and nothing else only works if you're Balatro or Vampire Survivors. No wonder they collabed. The first option is to expand the existing design space. Creating new mechanics results in new variables and combinations, allowing for new playstyles and niches. New enemies which encourage using said new mechanics then create new use cases without directly increasing numbers. Genshin makes heavy use of this. Every region introduces some new mechanic which incentivizes using new characters, even though they don't always yield greater numbers. Sumeru introduced the Dendro element, Fontaine had Numa and Ozia, Natlan had Night Soul State, and now Notcry has Lunar Charge. That said, this can eventually lead to feature creep. If you aren't careful, the game becomes overloaded with multiple niche mechanics with zero real game impact, which can also intimidate casual players. That's how you end up with excessively long text descriptions and keywords. Not very nice to look at. Another option is to reset the metagame. The game could implement a rotating ban list, change the pool of enemies, or create a whole new game mode with different rules altogether. Even something as simple as removing a previously existing character can create new team and matchup possibilities. Imagine what an extra team slot or a whole new rule set could do. This indirectly addresses the opportunity cost issue by destabilizing player consensus. It takes time for players to evaluate the value and opportunity cost of each option in relation to the existing meta. So by regularly changing the options, the community's opinions will never stay fixed. This is mostly seen in card games which have a set rotation and seasonal formats, but other games use it too. Star Rail features multiple endgame modes, with enemies and bosses changing with each reset, causing character viability to vary wildly. Characters which previously fell out of the meta may unexpectedly see a resurgence in usage due to boss mechanics which favor their playstyles. For a while, people thought break playstyle characters got power crept in damage, until a new boss showed up which requires you to break them to bypass its damage resistance. Pokemon unintentionally accomplishes this with each game having a different regional dex and pool of Pokemon. Incineroar is currently the best Intimidate user, but it'll disappear once the next game releases, allowing alternatives to fill the gap. Yet another option is to directly tamper with buffs and nerfs. This is what most players typically call for as the solution to power creep, but it's more of a temporary band-aid. Buffs raise the performance of a lucky few characters, but the overall power level of the game is still unaffected. If anything, it indicates developers wish to add more difficult content or raise enemy HP levels, and so give players a few freebies to keep up. However, their small impact is also their main advantage. They are far easier to implement and deploy than new game modes and mechanics, making them useful for minute adjustments which tweak the metagame towards a desired result. They just gain a lot of positive reception because people get really happy when their favorites get stronger, making their impact more personal and immediately felt. It's like personal recycling. Yes, it has a positive impact, can make a difference on a local level, feels good because you're getting personally involved and is legitimately important to do, but you can't expect it to solve the wider scope issue of global climate change. The best overall long-term solution is to generate non-gameplay related appeal. Story, artwork, character design, voice actors, cool animation, all of this creates a perception of value beyond just numbers. The end result is a hugely popular character whose fans will use in spite of their performance rather than because of it. For Genshin players, think back to Arlecchino's debut. She was extremely popular due to her story significance and presentation, but numerically she's not that much of a step up from Hu Tao, who released years before her and shares the same element, weapon and playstyle. And no, we will not address the Xiangling in the room. In Star Rail, there's Cyrene, a hyper-specialized support whose design of extremely slow ramp-up for incredibly powerful and exclusive buffs actively goes against the metagame's focus on defeating enemies within as few turns and actions as possible. While her buffs are genuinely game-changing, they only work for a small specific cast of characters and are also incompatible with all future characters. This, alongside her long ramp-up time, limits her usability to a small number of meta teams. Don't misunderstand though, Cyrene is a legitimately powerful character, but in a rich get richer kind of way. The few teams she does work in do see a major boost, but those teams are already some of the best and most expensive teams in the meta even before her addition anyway, so investing into her doesn't yield any real benefit because you're already in the highest score brackets. The end result is that from a purely game mechanics standpoint, Cyrene's steep investment cost and niche applications make her difficult to recommend to the average player over alternative support characters. Unless you will and max her out, but at that point any character will be broken. However, and this is a long list. She is also the central figure and main companion for the game's longest story arc, received extensive marketing, is an XP of the most popular character from one of the company's previous games, has extremely heavy ship bait with the main protagonist and romance-themed animations such as a wedding dress-inspired outfit, putting on a ring, blowing kisses and shooting heart-shaped projectiles, and, most importantly, is a pretty pink-haired elf waifu with big boobs.
You think so too, right?
They even sold a cosmetic weapon skin which does literally nothing except insert the player character into her ultimate animation just for more ship bait. To nobody's surprise, she's one of the game's biggest money earners. Her debut catapulted the game to the top of the iOS sales charts for Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan. Considering how huge China's market is, that's a lot of people spending money for a pink elf waifu, regardless of her actual gameplay value and what characters that player has access to. Look, don't take this the wrong way. I don't intend to sound rude, but gacha gamers are really easy to take advantage of sometimes. If you've ever worked on a gacha game, you'll just kinda learn to stop feeling sympathy for the people who drop thousands of dollars for digital characters. If you aren't taking their money, they'll happily give it to a different company's PNG waifu instead, and probably throw plenty of toxic vitriol at you in the process. So if you are a gacha game dev, don't hesitate to take advantage of these people's parasocial desperation for love. They aren't worth saving. Save your sympathy to help people with real struggles, like kids without access to education or people suffering from disease. That's how you actually make a real difference and build a better world. On that note, never underestimate the value of manipulating emotions. We aren't robots. We are totally willing to disregard logic to make suboptimal and financially irresponsible decisions based on emotional desires. It's the reason why Pokemon like Charizard, Absol, and many others are so beloved despite their in-game mediocrity. When you like a character just because, you'll naturally derive enjoyment from using them. You don't need to get the best score to be happy. Just getting a good score on your own terms is enough. This is also the reason why TCGs like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic are heavily susceptible to power creep. They aren't selling characters, but cards, and you can't really love a card. Unless you are Seto Kaiba, since Blue Eyes White Dragon is literally his wife. This isn't a joke. Games which are purely mechanical and driven heavily by competitive play cannot easily build emotional attachment because players will only care about performance and winning since that's the point of the game. Inversely, the more casual and less skill-dependent the game experience, the less important the meta, and the less players will care about performance. This is the other long-term solution to power creep. Convince the players that it's unimportant. Regrettably, this also happens for climate change. But in this case, it's a positive thing. If power creep happens, but only 10% of the player base seriously cares or are negatively affected, then it's effectively not a problem. As long as the majority of players are happy and finding enjoyment in the game, who cares about the rising power levels? Only the hardcore users will be upset, and these players are a vocal minority who will still play the game regardless. As a developer, you should never cater to the vocal minority. Your job is to make the most fun experience for as many people as possible, so you need to understand what the majority truly enjoys about your game, or at least understand the people who actually spend money. Anyways, games which are casual experiences can sidestep this. The majority of their content could be completed by all of the playable cast, may have side content which don't involve combat, or de-emphasize their metagame. Pokemon has a lot of competitive mechanics like IVs, EVs, natures, hidden abilities, double battle mechanics, which the overwhelming majority of players can ignore with zero consequence. There's nothing stopping you from playing through the game with your favorite unevolved Pokemon. In fact, the community will outright commend you for the dedication. This is why the games keep adding new ways to interact and play with your Pokemon every generation. It helps cultivate a casual attitude among the general player base. Genshin's nature as an open world game means it has a lot of content to explore, all of which is doable by the full cast of characters, and the majority of their events are non-combat, focusing more on exploration, story, or minigames. In fact, Genshin's metagame is so de-emphasized, it is estimated that Spiral Abyss is only done by 10% of the total active user base, and it took roughly 5 years for them to add a second endgame mode. On the other side, Star Rail's meta power creep occurs at a much faster pace. Within less than 3 years, it got 3 different major combat endgame modes, a special extra hard 4th mode, and a weekly roguelike challenge mode. While it does have a lengthy story, side quests, and lots of minigames, it doesn't have anything like Genshin's huge explorable world to occupy players with, so it needs to rely more heavily on combat to retain long-term player engagement, leading to faster meta power creep. Genshin honestly handles its power creep unexpectedly well, at least by gacha standards. In the end, power creep only matters if the game and players make it matter. You'd be surprised how fun games can be when you stop trying to be the very best like no one ever was. During these past 30-odd minutes, you've heard me talk about how power creep works, what makes it happen, which games are susceptible to it, how it's a natural process, why developers artificially accelerate it, and the various ways they mitigate it. Is there any grand conclusion to all of this? Not really. For certain games, power creep is simply inevitable. It's something set into motion for reasons beyond the player's control, and no amount of complaining or negativity from the game's community will change it, no matter how unhinged. At the end of the day, the only real winning move is not to play. If a game's power creep has escalated to the point where you are actively upset over it, it might be time to reevaluate why you liked that game in the first place, before you delve deeper and learn about the power creep. Was it the gameplay, the world, the story, the characters? Are you still having fun? Can you still enjoy the game? If the answer is yes, then it's better to focus on the parts you actually do enjoy, and not to stress over the parts which aren't fun. Let go of your competitive spirit and enjoy it more casually. If the answer is no, it might be a sign to move on to a new game, or at the very least, take a break. Games are meant to be fun experiences, not make you miserable. Real life already does that. Perhaps you might disagree with my sentiments. At any rate, I hope you at least found this dive into the developer's side of power creep to be an interesting learning experience. And do let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to continue listening to me ramble on about game development, then here's another video. You should watch it. If not, then I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.